In our previous video, we told a story about the first generation of multi-role aircraft. Their existence proved so important on various war occasions, both in World War I and World War II. After the Second World War ended until the birth of the first-generation jet fighter in the late 1940s, there was not a single jet fighter that deserved to be called a multi-role. It was not until later in the second generation during the mid-1950s that some fighter jets could be called multi-role with a profound effect on the Cold War competition. Do you want to know the most iconic multi-role and second-generation jet fighters during the Cold War? How was the comparison between the US and the Soviets? Let's delve into history. In July 1953, a recent armistice occurred between North and South Korea after a war that killed more than 3 million people. This war, which is called the Korean War, has opened the eyes of the US and the Soviets that air combat must evolve to conditions that have never been imagined before. If previously in a Second World War, the large-body B-29 aircraft from the US was able to drop a nuclear bomb on Hiroshima and ended the war, just 6 years later during Korean War, the B-29 was almost rendered useless, limited only to night mission. The B-29 was indeed capable of carrying heavy bombs and flying long distances, but was too slow to evade the faster Soviet fighter, the MiG-15. That's just the first problem. The second problem came from the very distance of war operations. The Korean War has shown how important it is for fighter aircraft to launch from an aircraft carrier rather than from an inflexible land air base, and even if flying from the ground, the air refueling tactic became vital to increase the range of operations, a tactic that was not well known at that time. The third problem emerged from the preference for air battle at night, which forced fighter aircraft to be able to operate in all situations, be it a day, night, good weather, or bad weather, so it required more sophisticated radar and sensor technology. Last but not least, for better war advantage, gathering enemy intelligence through air reconnaissance has never been more important than before. All these limitations actually could be lifted by one solution. Certainly, that is a multi-role jet fighter. A concept that existed in the imagination but was not immediately realized at that time. The second-generation jet fighter that could be called multi-role from the US came from the F-104 starfighter, which was developed in the early 1950s and took direct inspiration from the heat of the air war in Korea between the American F-86 Sabre and the Soviet MiG-15. As one of the Century series jet fighters, when first introduced, F-104 was a futuristic-looking aircraft. Even its manufacturer, Lockheed, stated it as a missile with a man in it. Not an exaggeration, F-104 was intended to be a cheap, lightweight, maneuverable, high-performance fighter to confront future Soviet fighters. The delay in development made the F-104 starfighter couldn't be introduced in Korean War, but its capabilities were a major breakthrough compared to the first-generation F-86 Sabre fighters. Be it speed, ordnance, radar, and service ceiling. All of them far exceeded the F-86 specification. The first flight of the F-104 occurred in March 1954, but its use in true combat only occurred 11 years later during the escalation of the Vietnam War. Sadly, no kill was confirmed, but F-104 managed to terrify the enemy using MiG fighter jets to the deterrent effect. Despite being originally created for air superiority, during the Vietnam War, the F-104 was also used in the fighter-bomber role. This is what makes the F-104 could be called the scary multi-role second generation from the US. Telling the Cold War saga, it's incomplete without discussing the Soviets. The few slight advantages the MiG-15 gained during the Korean War did not satisfy the Soviets at all. They knew the US would not stop innovating in fighter jet capabilities. In fact, the Soviets had planned to replace the MiG-15 even before the Korean War commenced. With super-fast development, the Soviets succeeded in creating MiG-17, MiG-19, and finally the legendary MiG-21, the most produced supersonic jet fighter in aviation history. The MiG-21 was the Soviet Union's first truly modern, second-generation jet fighter with a unique delta wing. A wing that could give high maneuverability during a dogfight, stability in high altitude and supersonic, and low drag for fuel efficiency. The first MiG-21 flight was in June 1955, and 4 years later, entered the Soviet service in 1959. Comparing the capabilities of the MiG-15 and MiG-21 is like comparing the Earth and the sky. All the specifications possessed by the MiG-21 far exceed what can be achieved by the MiG-15. With added cannon pod, more fuel capacity, and air-to-surface missile, MiG-21 even could be called a multi-role fighter. Despite MiG-21 also taking part in the Vietnam War, the direct clashes with the rival F-104 starfighter occurred on another battlefield further west, namely the Indo-Pakistan War in 1971. To be precise, on December 12, 1971, the Indian Air Force reinforced by MiG-21 fought fiercely with the Pakistan Air Force reinforced by the F-104 starfighter. Two of the F-104 were on operations to strafe an Indian air base. Did not remain silent, the Indian Air Force pursued F-104 desperately using the MiG-21 and fired R-3's infrared homing missile. Unfortunately for the MiG-21, their missiles could be diverted by the F-104's flares. But with better maneuverability, MiG-21 outmaneuvered F-104 and secured a kill with its cannon. Two more F-104 were also shot down later when they were escorting Pakistan Air Force bombers. The direct clash was indeed won by the MiG-21s and the Indian Air Force, but the Indian Air Force also lost 6 MiG-21s in another battle on the same day. Is it true that the Soviet MiG-21 was far superior to the US F-104? The short answer is yes. The detailed answer is that the MiG-21 had an advantage that the F-104 didn't have at all, namely one of the flight characteristics for making sharp turns. Sharp turns are important for jet fighters during an intense dogfight because they allow the fighter to quickly change direction and maintain a position behind the opponent. For comparison, the F-104 starfighter had a minimum turning radius of 610 meters, while MiG-21 had a minimum of 335 meters. This means that the MiG-21 has a much greater chance of getting behind the F-104 and not vice versa. Furthermore, even the F-104 still loses in terms of sharp turns to its Century series brother, the F-100 Super Sabre. This weakness was further exacerbated by the frequent accidents of the F-104, to the point that many pilots called it the Widowmaker. Because of this, the F-104 was used very briefly by the US Air Force, only used for 11 years, not more. Conversely, the MiG-21 until 2023 is still in use primarily from India. And in the past, Soviets itself used the MiG-21 for over 30 years. What's more, the MiG-21 was even able to compete and outperform the more modern US third-generation jet fighter, the F-4 Phantom. We would tell the story of the F-4 Phantom in another video. Such was the prowess of the MiG-21 for aerial combat matters and managed to astonish the Western world. That is the story of the jet fighter development, which can be called a multi-role from the second generation. Before long, with the increasingly fierce competition in the Cold War, followed by the growing sophistication of supersonic nuclear fighter bombers, the direction of fighter jet development began to shift to an intercept capability that was second to none. What is the next story in the development of the third generation? What was the most iconic of the third generation multi-role fighter jet? That will be the story in our next video. Stay tuned on this channel, don't forget to subscribe, and turn on notifications for our next video update. Thank you for watching.